Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 35 of the Ask Historians podcast. So this is a first of a two-part series on World War I. In this first part, we're going to be taking the idea of World War I, some of the myths, the misconceptions, the narratives, meta-narratives, things like that, and kind of dissecting them a little bit. So it's kind of going to be a little more of an abstract episode, so we're going to kind of jump from topic to topic a little bit. And then in part two, we'll go and kind of apply that in a little more linear narrative fashion by kind of looking at how the war changed from 1916 on. So here we'll be talking about the idea of, lines led by donkeys and walking lockstep into machine gun fire and being under constant shelling and living in ditches 365 days out of the year, things like that, but also the idea about who wrote about their experiences also helps to influence what we now think about this. And also, I really enjoyed the kind of side conversation we had about some of this results from more modern people, or I guess World War I is modern, but people from the post-World War II, and particularly in the Cold War era, kind of reinterpreting World War I through their own lenses of history at the time. So it's a very interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I certainly did. And we'll see you back in part two. Well, actually, technically, we'll see you at the very end of this podcast with little closing notes. But we'll see you in part two as well.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're here with Brian, known as Elos, on the Ask Historians subreddit, and we're going to be talking about World War I today, a little bit of kind of myths and misconceptions about it. But Brian, before we get started, why don't you go ahead and give us an idea about what got you interested in this subject?
Well, I kind of grew up in America, and I never really truly understood my heritage, which is French. My last name is French. And I started looking into the First World War, and I just got a huge passion for it out of nowhere. And basically, as it happened, I spent about a year gathering dozens of books on the war, and my study just gradually just kept going backwards in time. My flair on Ask Historians is France and Germany, 1618 to 1918, because the two people's history are just so intertwined. And that's where I am today.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about World War I and really kind of focusing in on some of the myths and misconceptions of the Great War, as it was known until that Second War came along and kind of eclipsed it a little bit, I guess you could say. But it seems that the kind of mythologizing of the Great War, even by calling it the Great War, started pretty early. So, do we have what kind of early popular or even kind of literary popularizations of this war and of its mythology do we have, even at the contemporary time of World War I?
Honestly, even before the war's beginning, the culture of mocking senior officers as aristocratic dinosaurs already existed. There was a big cultural, stigma against aristocratic leaders, especially in Britain, especially from the lower classes, who would be the ones massively conscripted and the ones entering Kitchener's army. In terms of other myths, though, generally the myth of the Glorious War, something that people today generally harp on, was a big thing. It was seen as a glorious thing. When people went to war in 1914 in Britain, the old people were going to protect what they perceived as the empire, and the young people thought it was an adventure, ultimately.
And we have this kind of very strong literary tradition as well, especially with war poetry. So, but I think sometimes the poetry of the war tends to, it seems to me that from what I've read is that there's really no middle ground. It's either the portrays as the worst thing ever, or this kind of, like you said, going out to protect the empire and doing your kind of manly duty. So, what was, when do we see this kind of literary war poetry tradition kind of coming up, and what kind of effect did it have on the perception of the war?
It really started to blow up in the 20s, and really, it was written in the 20s and 30s, but it started to blow up after the Second World War, especially in Britain and English culture, because there was this perception in British society that they were victims in the Second World War. They had the war at home, the Battle of Britain, the bombing of London, all that stuff, and they had this idea that war was futile, and that's a legitimate viewpoint to have. I'm not contesting that. After the Second World War, they looked at poetry like Wilfred Owen, and they saw a narrative which fit their perception of war as suffering and victimhood for the common person.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about Wilfred Owen, because I think he's probably the best well-known of these war poets, I guess you could say.
The biggest thing about Wilfred Owen is just how short and concise all of his works are. That's why he's so famous, argues Dan Todman, at least. You read all of these accounts of teachers in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they all bring in Wilfred Owen's work because it's 3 or 4 or 5, 6 lines. It's something that could be discussed and read over in an hour. It doesn't need a lot of analysis, so a 7th or 8th grader can really understand it. And conversely, it allows the kid to be engaged, because then the teacher can say, look how short this poetry is. Now you try writing your own war poetry. I grew up in Florida and went to high school in the 2000s, and we did that. We read British war poetry, and we wrote our own forms of British war poetry. It became so integral to the English education system, and that's really why.
So what kind of things was Owen writing about? What kind of these things that were being portrayed? Because when I think of war poetry, I don't think appropriate for middle schoolers.
It really wasn't very appropriate for middle schoolers. Here's a poem written by a child in about his 12 to 13-year-old range. It's called Days of Glory. Over the top, the officer calls, "Arge. Man by man, the regiment falls, like a tidal wave falling and slowing and falling. The repetitive sound of machine gun fire blitzes through like a schoolboy's choir. Then there is silence, until the cry of pain can be heard, time and time again." That's really graphic for an early teen to be writing about. But you can see the kind of exaggeration in it, It's what does blitzes through like a schoolboy's choir mean? It really speaks to how this war poetry really is. It's a giant exaggeration, like you said. It's an exaggeration in either direction, as it being this glorious, awesome, manly thing, or being this hopeless, futile, terrible tragedy. And there's no two ways about it.
So what was the actual? I mean, because I think of course, it's hard to write poetry about sitting in a trench playing cards. I mean, I guess you can do that, of course, but it's a little more dramatic, of course, to have the the over the top and the charging and things like that. But what was the average experience? What was the average kind of day, if there was an average day, you could say, for a soldier in the trenches of World War I?
What we need to understand is, and I just want to preface with this because I am going to get angry letters about this. We can't discard these experiences because they are real experiences, but we do have to put them in the context that they don't represent the totality of the war, like you said. The scale of the war just boggles the mind. I really just don't even know how to properly explain how big this war is. It covered the entire globe, from Mesopotamia, East Africa, Eastern Russia, in China. There's so many different experiences, we can't really say what a common experience would be. And even throughout the war, there was distinct change. We look back and we really focus on the people in the trenches and the artillery barrages and the riflemen going over the top. But we look, only recently have we really started to look at the non-combatant roles in the war. By the end of the war, a third of the British Army was in a non-combatant role, as in no artillery barrages, no threat of enemy danger, bureaucrats, administrators, people running logistical routes. The average life of them was pretty normal, and arguably just about every work I've ever read has come more or less to the conclusion the work of logistic people and administrators and bureaucrats mattered more than individual heroism and the story of the man going over the top. Because ultimately the war was won by how many more shells you put into the other side, not the glorious charge taking the trench, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But there is a general experience that we can draw on from those in the front line. In 1929, Charles Carrington would do a study, and he found that in 1916, a British junior officer spent less than a third of the year in a position which could be described as under fire, about 105 days, something to that effect. That means that they're either in a front trench or in one of the secondary trenches. They're under direct threat of enemy rifle fire or machine gun fire.
And so presumably they would be cycling in and out of these positions, right?
Yeah. The next third, his math came out to the full third that they would be about a few hours, 2 or 3 hours march behind the trenches. Basically how the war worked for everyone in the Western Front, you had a very thin screen on the front trenches, and you had a mass of reserves behind. You had local reserves, which are a few hours march away, and strategic reserves, which are a train rides away. And if an enemy attack came, you threw your reserves there, occupied the trenches, and threw them back. So really, most of the time, as his study showed, over 2/3 was spent not in the trenches, a regular British soldier, like a lieutenant. And in his time of combat, he would only actually do a direct combat action 4 times in an entire year. 4 times seeing actual combat. And only one of those was an actual direct assault on an enemy trench. 1 day out of 365. So we look at this modern myth that the war was this giant 365-day assault on enemy trenches with machine guns blasting at you every day. That's just not what it was. The war was mostly sitting around doing nothing.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up this idea of sitting in trenches and jumping out in front of machine guns, because I think when most people think of World War I, I know when I think of World War I, it's you sit in a muddy trench and then you kind of you go over the top and you charge across a field directly into machine gun fire. So, but at the same time, this was a war that did have its its forward and backward motion. So, was it all just sitting in trenches, or did these kind of tactics kind of evolve over time? What really I guess what I'm saying is, do we see some major differences between the way the war was fought in the earlier period and the way it was fought in kind of the later period, or was it all just trenches, machine guns, and artillery?
Well, one thing did remain constant mostly throughout the war. Like I said, sitting around doing nothing. I actually have the daily schedule of Jeffrey Bowen of the 2nd Battalion, Lancashire, I don't know how to say that word, Fusiliers. And it's just every 10 minutes is another sleep. 2:15 to 2:30 sleep, 4:30 to 4:35 sleep, 5:10 to 5:15 sleep. Most of this was just sitting around, sleeping, trying to catch up on 5 or 10 minutes of sleep, and being bombarded by artillery or eating. They ate a lot, something around 4,000 calories a day.
Well, presumably they were also doing a lot of digging trenches, building sandbags, things
lots
like
of manual labor. But in terms of tactics, like you asked, it's one of my least favorite popular myths about the war, that it was just a static thing. That was the biggest shock for me when I started reading about it, honestly, because you don't really get that sense in high school. You get the sense that is trench warfare. That's the word, trench warfare. It's this monolithic thing that existed for 4 years, but that's just not the case.
What do we see? Because of course this trench warfare did exist in this mind of this sitting in trenches, artillery barrage over the top, run forward. But I mean, what other varied experiences do we really see during this time as well?
The war can really be broken up into 4 phases, actually, every year, really. You go into 1914, and the war is fought basically how the Franco-Prussian War was fought in 1870-71. Not Napoleonic, not linear tactics. Men would be spread out in something called skirmishing lines. Men would have about 10 yards, give or take, on either side of them. It's a pretty good amount of distance. And the front line would be about 70 men wide. Then they'd have another 25 yards and another 70 men. And then about 200 yards behind them would be the rest of the battalion, sending up 2 lines at a time in waves to support the front infantry. That's how attacks worked. It was very skirmishy. It was very dynamic, is really the best word to use. It wasn't a lot of digging in trenches. There was a lot of maneuver and outmaneuver and ambush.
And so how does that change going forward? Because if obviously these 1870 Franco-Prussian tactics didn't proceed forward.
I'll contest that later, but in 1915 is a stalemate. 1915 is what we describe. It's all the myths of trench warfare in reality in that year. That's the year where it's all true, honestly. Basically, as it happened, they realized offensive wasn't really the best option for either side. And I'm going to use that very tentatively because people always try to focus in on the tactical level for why trench warfare began, and that's just not appropriate. They always say, oh, machine guns happened. So they started digging in more and more, and then, oh, crap, here we are, trench warfare. Both sides wanted trench warfare. Just on a strategic level, it was beneficial to their causes. After the Marne, the battle outside of France in late fall 1914, the Germans were in a precarious situation. The West wasn't going to be won quickly, but they had a big thing going for them. They were deep in enemy territory, and they had a crap load of soldiers in there. So what could they do? Well, they had the benefit of being able to give up 10, 20, 30 kilometers if it meant a more defensible position. And that's what the Germans did. They were going to hold off on the West and basically throw everything they had eastward to deal with Russia as quickly as possible, because they had them encircled with the Turks, with the Austro-Hungarians, and with themselves. So the Germans really had the biggest beneficial thing they could possibly have in any war. They got to choose precisely where they wanted to defend for the rest of the war. And they chose the biggest hilltops, the biggest plateaus, the most advantageous positions in France. And if they had to give up 30 or 40 kilometers just to get it, they were willing to do that. They were still in French territory, and they could do that. But then the French and British were also in a situation. Do they keep attacking these positions? And at the end of the day, one, they had to keep attacking them, but two, trench warfare was also beneficial for them because they had the blockade on Germany, and they had more manpower, and they had more resources. In attritional warfare, an attritional war benefited the British and French more than it did the Germans at the end of the day. So that's why they basically went with
it. So is this where we get the idea of, I guess, these kind of like human wave attacks of World War I, this idea that it was just this massive meat grinder against these German positions?
Yes. There's a lot of effort by people to try and justify these tactics away. But I'm not going to, because human waves, hand quotes, did kind of happen. But we also need to deal with the fact that the term human wave is a pejorative term. It's used to describe people who we perceive as too stupid to do anything more sophisticated. It's a term we use to say, oh, those idiots couldn't do anything but send human waves. But humans were used, and they attacked in waves of men. So in the literal semantical term, yeah, human wave attacks happened, but they weren't tactically inflexible. But the reality of the situation is that these were largely untrained, completely new to war people. These weren't professional soldiers anymore. They were conscripts in past 1916. And for the French and for the British, they were just regular people from a hamlet or some mining town that held a gun for the first time in their lives. They can't be expected to perform complicated, highly technical maneuver and fire warfare. And that's just the cold truth of it. It sucks to say. It really does suck to say, but that's the truth. That was the best thing that they had to work with. People who have never held a gun in their lives. And the best thing to do with them is to keep them close together so that the officer can keep track of them and make sure no one wanders off and everyone's kind of doing the right thing. And making them basically bum rush the enemy. It's sad, but it's true.
I mean, this also sounds like kind of the origin of this idea of, because I know the later very popular term was, especially for the British anyway, was lions led by donkeys.
Yes, that term is a bit problematic. Funny story is the person who actually made it, coined that phrase, Alan Clark, he knew the line was full of crap. And I wanted to bring this up earlier, but we didn't really veer down that road.
Let's veer now.
He was playing off the sensibilities of the people. He knew that there was this giant angst against the aristocratic people leading them into battle. It was perceived as the regular old miner and farmer being led by the aristocratic donkey who didn't give two hoots about them. That perception existed at the time. And that's where that phrase came from. It was a word meant to evoke that kind of emotion out of them and basically sell his own books at the end of the day. Really, this entire giant thing about the lions led by donkeys, the horrible experience of the generals in the trenches and the tragedy could, and I'm saying a very strong could here, be just a social phenomena of the fact that this is really the first war where a conservative rural population experienced this type of total warfare and could write about it. Because we know from reading the accounts of everyone who wrote about this war, people who grew up in mining, industrialized cities and towns generally had neutral to positive experiences with the war. But everyone from the rural areas of Britain especially, those are the people who have this giant emotional backlash from the war. That's really ultimately, arguably, where it comes from. It's this rural tradition coming out of nowhere that they're like, whoa, this is what war is really like. We're not used to these industrialized conditions of barbed wire and smog and mud and so on and so forth, you know?
So it sounds like you're saying that when these people were going back, when they were traveling back, when the war was over, when they were, being decommissioned, that part of this rise of the narrative of World War One of being this blasted wasteland was simply because these people would come from kind of like this idealized bucolic English countryside into what I guess the people from the outskirts or downtown London at that point would be like, well, yeah, it's just a construction site.
So argues Corelli Barnett, at least. That's, I think the words he used specifically it was dominated by a group of middle-class poets raised in a rural tradition. And at the end of the day, and this is something that really does have to be tackled, and it's going to piss off a lot of people from across the Atlantic Ocean, we really have to address the fact that a lot of these narratives are false. Or partially false, or completely false, and that the gaps are filled by the popular perceptions. We have so many examples of people who just didn't remember. Adrian Carton de Wyatt, he got a Victoria Cross for storming a machine gun nest by himself and taking it. He doesn't remember that. He never remembered that, ever. People told him it happened. He had witnesses that it happened, but he doesn't remember. It's a blank spot in his memory. Mark Bloch, even he recalled his first day of combat. Even so, my recollections are not altogether precise. Above all, they are poorly articulated, a discontinuous series of images, vivid in themselves, but badly arranged like a reel of film that showed here and there large gaps and the unintended reversal of certain scenes.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that part of shaping this narrative of the war was the fact that on occasion there was there was a lot of sitting around and doing nothing, punctuated by some very violent and very dramatic action, but even that could be poorly understood, poorly remembered, and therefore kind of shaped into a narrative.
Well, I'm not going to say that it wasn't psychologically traumatizing, because it was. It was. I don't know how these people kept saying, and I know that sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but what I'm contesting is the myth of the constant human wave assault. It was mostly sitting around, but the sitting around was horrifying if you've never been exposed to those types of industrial conditions before. A mental exercise, physical exercise for the listeners is something my professor did for us once. It's to clasp your hand over your ears really tightly at the bottom of your palms and start tapping the back of your head lightly but very quickly. And you're just going to get this little, this constant, vague, distant, empty shelling sound. And that's day in, day out for however long they're on front. And it's terrifying. It really... I have read these firsthand accounts of people under artillery fire, and it is the most heartbreaking thing I've ever read in my life. It's exceptionally just terrible. But we have to understand that these firsthand accounts are coming from people so psychologically traumatized, a lot of times it isn't reliable. And these gaps are created, just like Mark Bloch said. And when wider myths are particularly strong, individuals are either consciously or subconsciously encouraged to fill those gaps or to make additions to the memories to align with the popular perception. Whether it's a sense that they want their story to be heard by everyone, or they just want to feel accepted, or maybe they just genuinely believe that's what happened.
Yeah, so when do we have these first-hand accounts being kind of melded or merged into kind of our modern narrative of the war then?
Mm-hmm.
So when do these first-hand accounts that are coming out contemporary with the war, coming out, being written by the people who can write anyway, when do these start being kind of put together and formed into kind of this much wider modern narrative?
We have to differentiate when it was written and when it began, as you said, the rise. It was all written either in the war or in the 20s, more or less. And the rise, however, is about the 60s, the 1960s. I'm not going to try to say I have the answer for why, because we don't know. We don't know why precisely it rose, but there are a couple things that lead to a general conclusion. In the 1960s is when that generation of soldiers who fought in the war started to die off, and that their stories stopped being told by the people who were there, but by the people who heard them say it. And moreover, these stories were being told by people who weren't there, telling them secondhand in the context of the Cold War, after the trauma of the Second World War that they firsthand experienced, which was drastically more traumatizing for the average Briton back home than the first.
So you're saying that it was kind of a backwards interpretation. So people who had lived through the Second World War were taking these World War I narratives and kind of using them to inform their own ideas about what happened.
Essentially, yes. They're trying to, one of the biggest things that comes up is it came out in the 60s and 70s in the context of the Cold War. The World War I was the war which was supposed to be deterred by the simple fact that great powers don't want to fight great powers. It's obvious how that connects to the Cold War. And that's where it came from. But the most convincing argument I've heard, at least, is that, one, it serves as a sense of remembrance and traumatizing, simplifying everything down into easily digestible terms, the Wilfred Owens. And two, it was really the opening of the tensions that arose in the 20th century. These things that are also common to us that we still talk about today, they all arguably started in World War I. These social issues like, was status defined by age, wealth, or ability? Was the relationship of individuals to the vast corporations of the world, were they a part? Like, how did they work in with that? Could we as an individual control our fate, or were we just cogs in a machine? How did a citizen relate to their government in greater democracy? And if nations can mobilize their entire population, who should benefit from the sacrifice of war? These are things which we still talk about today in one way or another. And World War I, at least in the West, in English culture, English and American, this is when these ideas started to rise up. And the negative myths of the First World War much, much, much better fit with how the regular people were perceiving the answers to these things.
So in a sense, World War I being used as a proxy for the conversation happening at the time.
Essentially, yeah. Here's this thing coming off that the myths are necessarily negative, and I don't want to give up that perception because there are beneficial things that came from it. Incorrect is not equal bad. I really just want to emphasize that. Because, yes, the fear of World War I led to another World War I, arguably led to the conciliatory attitude towards Hitler and the Nazis' rise. But it also led to a completely new understanding of war, that the army must make use of technology and not waste men, that war can't be futile, it has to have a cause, and that people have to be behind it, and that the people aren't left out from the spoils of war. It's their war, not the government's war. These ideas were critical to success in the Second World War, in popular support in the Second World War, in stopping Nazism and so forth. So we can look at those negative myths of the First World War as strictly horrible things, but in many ways it also advanced our culture and society in ways that looked at war in a more balanced way. It wasn't this glorious thing that we just did. It had to have a purpose. It had to have function. It had to be done appropriately, you know?
I want to loop back around to what you said earlier about the idea of great powers not wanting to fight each other, because I think one of particularly in contrast to the Second World War, which we see as a war, as you said, with a purpose, with a function. But I think one of the ideas that we have about World War I is that it was just kind of like stumbled into, that it was a war by accident.
Yeah, that is a popular thing. One of the biggest things that are said to me is, it's just said in general about the war, not necessarily to me, is that it was a useless war, that it was started by capitalists to test out their new toys, or it was forced and no one could really stop it, or it was done by accident. And that's just not appropriate. At the end of the day, we have to accept that World War I was started because the world wanted World War I to start. They wanted it. It happened. It was in their interests. If they didn't want to go to war on that side, they didn't have to. Italy didn't. Italy could have gone to war on Central Power side if they wanted to, and they didn't, because it didn't align with their interests. Their interests lied in the Western Austria-Hungary and Slovenia and such, Tyrol.
Yeah, so what about this idea that, because I think this is a very popular kind of counterfactual history idea that if Franz Ferdinand hadn't been assassinated, World War I never would have happened.
There's a term I used in one of my posts a long time ago, that World War I wasn't inevitable, but the stage had been set. It was going towards it. It was as close to as inevitable as you can get. One of the analogies one of my old professors used, it was a Cold War without nuclear weapons. And in that sense, that means it was going to happen. If the Cold War didn't have nuclear weapons, it wouldn't have been a Cold War. It would have been a war. And that's the sense that we need to understand. These were two power blocks which were made in the early 1900s. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy tentatively thrown in there, but the Ottomans are more appropriate to throw into that group. These are all powers looking to hold on to their empires and expand their influence. And we have the Entente powers, sometimes called the Allies, because they just want to make connection to World War II. Britain in particular was concerned with containment of this expansion. And France wanted to contain German influence. And Russia wanted to contain Austro-Hungarian and Turkish influence in the Balkan Peninsula. So we have one power block trying to expand and another trying to stop their expansion. In that sense, the war was inevitable. But we can't remove human agency because they wanted it to happen. Austria-Hungary wanted the war to start. Germany did her actions understanding a war was going to happen. And we can't remove that agency from them.
Yeah, actually, to go back to this idea of human agency, but in a very different way, there is this idea that when talking about, again, these kind of political discussions and class discussions that you brought up, about that World War I was kind of the phrase, the stab in the back.
Oh, yeah. Usually used with the Germans. Always used with the Germans, hopefully. And it's to do with the fact of the German defeat. And this is a massive segue, but it does need to be talked about. This idea that Germany, on a greater sense, thank you for bringing this up, but this brings up something that especially neo-Nazis, just to go way out of left field, like to tout around, that Germany didn't lose the war. Germany was still fighting in occupied territory when the war ended, and they just won in the East. They didn't lose the war. They were stabbed in the back by the Navy and the socialists and the Jews. And this comes from the fact that, in a sense, Germany's home front contributed very heavily to their defeat. In 1918, after the Jutland the 1916 naval battle between Britain and Germany, Germany was incapable of sending her surface fleet out and fighting the British anymore. Her fleet was locked in. And as you can imagine, the Navy was kind of pissed because they were like, our country is literally starving to death because we aren't out there doing something. We could be doing something. We could be building more ships. We could be out there fighting. We could be out there contesting. But we're sitting here doing nothing while our countrymen starve. And the government is responsible. And then once 1918 comes around, October, November 1918, they get told out of nowhere to go on a last hurrah suicide charge against the British blockade. And they're like, screw you. We're not doing that. We're not that expendable. We're not your toys. And they revolted. And with that revolt came a socialist revolution as well. And it captured Berlin. They captured Berlin. It said, we can't know for sure. Hugh Strachan says that it happened, but we can't know for sure. But it's said that every single home base of the army revolted in tandem with the Navy. That's how serious it was. So there was this sense of home revolution, but the military front itself in Belgium and in France was collapsing without a doubt. Even without the home front revolutions, Germany was done for.
So, and another idea, I think, is this idea of, on the German side, of course, you have this idea that the brave men of the army were stabbed in the back by socialists and spineless politicians, but on the Allied side, there is this also idea of this lost generation. That that the war devastated an entire generation of men, that they just vanished into these machine gun fire.
That is a popular thing, yes, and it really isn't an appropriate term, in my opinion. I don't think it's right. This is going to cause a lot of drama, but it is how the scholarship is turning as we go into the 21st century. I've read books from the 70s, Martin Middlebrook's work, and I've read works that go into the 80s and 90s and thousands, and I've read Dan Todd's work, I believe it's actually written in 2012 or something to that effect. And the narrative is shifting into this idea that it really wasn't that lost of a generation. And it's even been claimed, I don't have the direct numbers for this in front of me, but I have seen it claimed numerous times in academic works, that it was a picture less of a lost generation and more that the expected mortality of the period was replaced in terms of cause rather than amount. That is, if you looked at a census chart in 1913, 1915 or 16, and then in 1920, you wouldn't be able to tell the war happened because those men were going to die in other ways. They just died on the battlefront, on the battlefield, instead of at home.
So, are you saying that they're really, because I think the idea is that the population had this dramatic plummet on account of the war.
There was a dramatic plummet of population, but it wasn't, and I don't want to say it's not cataclysmic, because we're still living in a period where people experienced the loss of it. But we need to come to the reality that it wasn't this unique event. John Caldwell, in his work Social Upheaval and Fertility Decline, showed that the population and population rate dips that happened during the war happened 13 other times in history, then or since or before the war. It wasn't unique. It was a tragedy. It was horrible. It greatly affected the people in it, but it wasn't unique.
You say this is not a unique event, but how did it compare with, say, the one that turned it from the Great War to the World War I? How does the experience of people and also kind of the larger demographic and social changes compare to World War II then?
I don't know specifically the social demographics of the Second World War. My study ends basically in 1919 or 1920. I went backwards rather than forward. But I do have a lot of firsthand accounts of the Second World War. And I can say the soldiers' experience, it can be compared. It can be compared forward and it can be compared backwards. I remember back on Ask Historians, I had someone very fervent in the idea that the war was the most tragic war that ever happened. It was the most horrible war that ever happened. And I read them this piece, this firsthand account. A scene of utter desolation. I have never seen such bomb craters. Trees were uprooted, roads were impassable. There were bodies in half crumpled men. A tank lay upside down. Another was still burning with a row of feet sticking out from underneath. In one crater, a man's head and shoulders appeared sticking out from the side. The place stank. And that's from 1944 in France. And I brought out more first-hand accounts. I don't have them with me. They're in my Napoleonic Wars books back on my bookshelf. Wars from the Russian front in 1812 and accounts from the Crimean War, all the siege and trench warfare in the Crimean War in the 1850s. You have all these similar accounts of bodies hanging from trees, dismembered corpses being picked up by men carrying bags. This all happened before. Something I say very often when dealing with these types of perceptions of the war is, yes, World War I was brutally horrible. That's not because World War I was uniquely horrible. It's because modern warfare is uniquely horrible. And modern warfare, of course, referring from a military history, a military theory standpoint, beginning in the end of the Napoleonic Wars to VJ Day in 1945, roughly. That entire period is distinctified by its brutality and its gore and its unprecedented amount of scale. And we need to remember that when we're looking at the First World War. This isn't horrible because it's World War I. It's horrible because that's what modern warfare is. It's imprecise, it's brutal, but it's ruthlessly efficient.
Yeah, I think this brings us to something that we've kind of also, at least with regard of comparing World War One, which is a brutal experience to all these other brutal experiences, that this idea that part of the reason that World War One was more brutal was because it comes down to this functionality, this idea that it was useless. I guess you could say the useless wars is as far as I've heard before.
Mm-hmm. Every time I hear that, I just have to say, useless for whom? It can maybe be seen as useless for a British perspective because they're basically intervening. But was it useless for a Belgian? The Germans just short of committed, if they just went a few steps further, they would have been committing genocide against the Belgians. The Polish people, was it useless for them? It's practically a national holiday in that country. It's their liberation from over a century and a half of being occupied by Russian, Austrian, and Prussian, German, but mostly Prussian occupation. The Slavic people of the Balkans, the Slovenians, the Serbians, the Bulgarians, the Croatians, all these people vying to get out of Austro-Hungarian rule. That's what they were fighting for. The French were being occupied. The Germans thought that their position in the world was threatened, that they were under constant threat of French and Russian hegemony. They were fighting for something real, and that's why they went to war, because they felt that those were legitimate things to fight over. And in many cases, I'd argue they're completely right. The war wasn't useless for a Belgian or for a Frenchman, in my opinion, or for a Russian, or for a Serbian, or even for a German.
Yeah, so it seems like part of our popular misconception is based upon this kind of, at least particularly in the United States and the Anglo-speaking, the anglosphere as well, is based upon, like you said, this idea of who was writing about it and who basically this idea that these narratives were shaped by a literate, almost rural educated class.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any kind of concluding kind of remarks that you'd like to make on that point?
The biggest thing I would emphasize is that we see these negative perceptions coming primarily from British and Anzac perspectives, because from an Australian or from a Canadian or from a New Zealander or from an Indian or from a British standpoint, they had no stake in that war, really. They were going over there and fighting the French's battle or fighting the Belgians' battle. So they had no personal stake in the war to base their experience on. It's like, why are we here? And that's really fundamentally where these perceptions come from. More so than the rural argument, more so than the remembrance and recuperation argument. That's where it stems from. That's where the useless lore comes from. It's from that perspective of why are we here? If you read French or German accounts or Belgian accounts, they're fine. They like the war. They think it's a great thing.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for talking to us today on the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for listening. I really appreciate this episode and the kind of the tack that Elos took in trying to be both very critical of the narratives of World War I, but also saying that we can't really discount them entirely, that they do have at its heart, of these ideas that we have about World War I. There is some truth to it, but also that it was a much more dynamic and much more complicated story, that the actual facts on the ground had a great deal more variety to the experiences that than we well, I guess we commonly think of, hence the narrative there. But also the fact that the way these narratives were constructed through the historical process and through people's writing and reinterpretations of primary sources and through the lens of their own contemporary times, it's just kind of a fascinating way to look at the topic of World War I, which really, I think partly of what I really appreciated about this was kind of taking something that seems so very monolithic and showing just how complicated it could really be. Because if history is about anything, it's about overcomplicating things. So, but I hope you'll come back for the second part of this episode. We'll be putting some of the more abstract ideas that we talked about here into kind of more a practical narrative format. We'll be starting basically from the Battle of the Somme and going forward in time through the last part, the latter half of World War I, to really kind of demonstrate in more practical terms about how the war changed over time, and to show that even if in retrospect some of the decisions that were made seem like complete utter insanity, that there were rational, practical considerations put into those decisions at the time. So until then, as usual, please rate and review us on iTunes, so whatever black magic happens that bumps up our popularity happens there. So when you are discussing this at the water cooler at work, people are thinking, oh yeah, you heard the last episode of the Ask Historians podcast? I did too. Let's discuss it. And if you don't have a water cooler at work, I suggest you get one, because hydration is important. Also, feel free to come by the Ask Historians subreddit and to the discussion posts and ask any questions or follow-up you might have. This can be about this episode in general or about the podcast, just at large. So and I do respond to those when I can, and forward along questions to our guest as well. So it's never too late to come by and bother us about that. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.